on the main issues, including territorial concerns. The talks, scheduled for 17th and 18th of February, will involve Russia, Ukraine and the United States. The Russian delegation will be led by President Putin's aide, Vladimir Medinsky, and will also include military intelligence chief Igor Kustovo. A separate working group will discuss economic matters, with Putin's special envoy Kirill Dmitriev representing Russia. These talks come at a time when Kyiv faces mounting pressure from the US to reach a deal, while Moscow continues to demand control over the entire Donbas region. Key issues such as who controls the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and the role of Western troops in the post-war Ukraine remain major sticking points. US President Donald Trump has expressed his desire to help broker an end to the conflict. We are now being joined by Alison Mutzler, who is a former AP Borough Chief, and she is joining us from Bucharest. Thank you so much, Alison, for joining us here today on NewsX World. What
Hello.
Does Moscow's willingness to discuss territorial issues in Geneva suggest about its negotiating strategy and priorities?
Well, obviously all kinds of information have been coming out from the talks over the last few months, but what it's boiling down to is territory. Now, Moscow has maximalist demands. It wants as much territory as it can obtain, territory which it has not seized during its hostilities against Ukraine. And that is something that Ukraine hasn't been prepared to budge on. That is the sticky issue. There are other issues they will budge on, but territory is a key issue because, quite rightly, they say that if Moscow hasn't captured these areas, hasn't acquired them, to quote Donald Trump, acquired them, then why should Ukraine relinquish them? The fact that Moscow is saying that it will discuss territory is because they're cutting to the chase. That's the main issue. I haven't seen anything to suggest at this moment, and that doesn't mean it hasn't happened or is not happening behind the scenes, that Moscow will back down from its maximalist demands. And that will be the sticking point, and it has been the sticking point between the two sides, Ukraine and Russia. The fact that Russia says it wants to discuss territory means, for once, Russia is being upfront. Usually they say things very indirectly, they hint at things, they allude to things, they don't say things, or they make sarcastic jokes, they don't say things directly. But now they're saying something directly. I would expect them at Geneva, at negotiating tables, to repeat their maximalist demands. Now, I might be wrong, and if I am, that will be a change in Russia's attitude. But so far, Russia has been very inflexible in its demands.
And can these territorial disputes, historically the most contentious part of the Ukraine conflict, be realistically addressed in diplomatic talks?
Hard to say. I mean, the obvious solution for somebody who's, not a diplomat would be, a frozen area, a no-go zone, which is patrolled perhaps by foreign troops. And, some territorial concessions, if there is to be an end to this 4-year war, there will be some territorial concessions, but that will have to be in agreement with Ukraine. And there's a lot of pressure on Ukraine. But the only way I can see some sort of resolution in other areas is a sort of frozen area, a no man's land, which is patrolled by foreign troops, which again, international troops, or international forces, will be very tricky for Moscow, I think, to stomach, to agree to. But that could be some sort of solution. But again, all these things are very, very tricky.
And obviously, as we know, there's been talks and no really clear path has really come out of them. The only thing really is the prisoner exchange. Does this, what Moscow has now said about they want to bring up the territorial issues, Does this inclusion of this signal progress towards a substantive negotiation, or is it going to simply raise the stakes without a clear path forward?
As I said, Moscow is not known for being direct. They're not known for being frank, saying things clearly. The fact they've said this means that they are raising it and they're saying this is what we actually care about. But I don't see, I do not see Moscow backing away from its maximalist demands and demanding practically all of Donbas. And I don't see at this point Ukraine agreeing to that. It's possible that Donald Trump can step in and say, bash their heads together and come to some kind of compromise agreement that there will be an area which is controlled by international troops and doesn't belong to either country. That's possible, but I just think I do not see Russia budging on its position at all. It hasn't budged so far. It's the very reason why Vladimir Putin has stayed in power. It's because he plays this strong man. He doesn't budge an inch. He doesn't give an inch. He doesn't cede anything. And he marches on and he expects everybody to get in line. So I don't think it would be in Russia, the Kremlin's interest, to concede anything, to make concessions.
Thank you, Alison.
I might be wrong, but this is what I see at the moment.
Thank you. Don't go too far, as we will be back with you very shortly. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has responded calmly to Vladimir Zelensky's insult at the Munich Security Conference, where Zelensky criticised him for growing a belly instead of strengthening his army. Orban thanked Zelensky for his remarks, claiming they would help Hungarians understand the situation better. He emphasised that Ukraine's EU membership is not just about personal conflicts, but the future of Hungary, Ukraine and Europe. According to reports, Orban reiterated Hungary's position of opposing Ukraine's rapid EU accession due to security and economic concerns. We are now being joined back by our Alison Mutzler. Thank you for joining us back here today. How significant is Hungary in blocking Ukraine's path to an EU membership, and what does this reflect about the unanimity of requirements in the EU enlargement process?
It's very difficult. Hungary is basically playing a role for Moscow in the European Union. It's very critical of the European Union, but it doesn't want to leave the European Union. It's been very critical of Ukraine. It opposes military weaponry being sent there. I understand that Orban again brought up the issue of ethnic Hungarians who live in Ukraine. Again, that's another Russian talking point. The Russians, they have their own problem with the minority. They said Ukraine didn't give them enough rights. And then, there are Romanians and Moldovans who live there. But, Bucharest has stayed away from that. They're part of the Western Alliance. But Orban is raising these grievances. He's a thorn in the side of the EU. And yes, you do need unanimity to join the EU. So he could, along with Fico, the Slovakian Prime Minister, they could block Ukraine's accession to the EU, unless the EU does something for Hungary. But then we have elections in Hungary in less than 2 months, I think, probably 2 months, about 2 months' time, in April, early April. So it's possible that Orban might be out because he has a serious contender who is also patriotic, quote unquote, but much more pro-EU than Orban is.
And in the context of EU-Ukraine relations, how effective is public diplomacy, such as Zelensky's statements, compared with behind-the-scenes negotiations with member states like Hungary?
Well, obviously, there are what national leaders say publicly and what they say privately behind the scenes, and then there's also relations between, perhaps Orban has better relations with the Germans, for example, and they could be relied to lean on him. So it is hard to say. Obviously they have to make public statements, but behind the scenes other things are happening, and they will emerge later. But Orban has a very clear position. He accuses, I think, the European Union of funding the main contender in the elections. He's possible. He's in his last months of power. He's been in power since 2010, a very long time. And he's been very clear, anti-Ukraine, anti-EU, but again, still remaining in NATO, still remaining in the EU. So basically, he's a thorn in the side of Europe and NATO as well.
And should the EU reform its accession rules to prevent a single member from blocking strategic decisions, or does Hungary's position rightly reflect sovereign national interests?
Orban is playing a game here. Orban himself is playing a game. He's pro Donald Trump. He's pro Putin. We can't sugarcoat that. It is difficult, particularly as the EU is expanding, or there are members who are part of the accession process, including Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova. Who both fear Russian aggression, and they think that if they get to join, the European Union, it will, it will bring more of a rule of law, less corruption, more democracy, and these are things, to be honest, that Putin fears. And Orban, acting as a sort of spokesman, not exactly a spokesman, but acting as an agent for, or an asset for Vladimir Putin in Europe, he pushes this. But it is a tricky thing that it's not even one single country, it's one single politician could block, the entry of an accession of another country joining the European Union. And there are 27 members of the European Union, and so it does seem a bit tricky. It does seem a bit it's a vulnerability that one single country could block the accession of other countries. Which that if Ukraine and also Moldova were to become members of the EU, it would be a strategic decision. It wouldn't just be sort of like joining a members club.
Very much, Alison Mutler, for joining us here today on NewsX World. It's a pleasure speaking to you as always.